Okay, solutions for this need to control fiscal impact. Assuming that we are not using IPSAS, so we are not integrating in a natural manner the PPP commitments into the fiscal management systems of a country, the conventional KPIs, debt and deficit. Assuming for a moment that this is the case, we need to look for a solution to be able to integrate the PPP commitments, the PPP liabilities, into the public control, into the control of public finances. So there is an alternative approach to using IPSAS, which would be to integrate the debt statistics with the value of PPP commitments. Okay, so for example, if traditionally in a particular country or by means of a specific public finance law, like in Europe, some countries in Europe, we could have a maximum level of debt of let me try to write. Okay, doesn't matter. We could have an overall limit of public debt of, let's say, 70% debt, or the debt at a maximum amount should be 70% of the GDP in every year. And we could just incorporate in that KPI PPP liabilities and increase that threshold 90% to, for example, 93%. Okay, so the new threshold to be controlled is that the sum of the explicit debt plus PPP liabilities over the GDP is not more than the 93% of the GDP. We have IPSAS, okay? If IPSAS would be integrating in a natural manner the PPP liabilities into the overall control, the traditional control in terms of maximum deficit, I mean, for example, 3% or maximum level of debt, because it would be regarded as a debt, the direct liabilities of PPPs, okay? Or another manner, if we are not using IPSAS, is to integrate the overall amount of explicit debt, the KPI, as a percentage of the GDP, together with the amount of PPP liabilities, okay? So I control the aggregation of the explicit debt and PPP liabilities. However, we have another approach, which I consider is less efficient, but that is becoming very common in certain regions, for example, in Latin America, and is to have a specific separated control of the PPP liabilities, okay? So this is typically established by the PPP law in many countries, a specific ceiling of the aggregate amounts of the commitments, PPP commitments, in terms of net present value, for example, 2 billion, and it has to be compared every year with the GDP, and it has to be kept under a certain threshold. For example, in Paraguay, they have a threshold of 2% of the GDP. So the total amount in net present value of all the future PPP commitments of the PPP portfolio of a certain year should be lower than 2% of the GDP of that particular year. So some countries are controlling the aggregated exposure in stock terms, so it's net present value is the stock of the commitments. Some countries are controlling the flow. I mean, any single year, for any single year, the aggregated value of payments to be made any particular year against the GDP duly projected for that year. For example, in Paraguay, they are using both. They are controlling the flow and they are controlling the stock. And the flow is that the estimate of the every year flow of commitment should be below 0.4% of the GDP of that projected year. Some countries will use only the flow, okay? The control in the flow amounts of the future PPP liabilities. I think there are a number of pitfalls for this approach, and we will go into much more detail during our course. We are solving the problem of the PPPs. We are solving the problem or limiting the problem of the PPPs, the bias in favor of PPPs, because this free money perception, but we are creating a different bias. We are creating the opposite bias, because at certain point, I will have the incentive to use conventional contracts, conventional financing, rather than PPP, just to preserve the fiscal space that I have assigned to PPPs. So it would be the opposite situation than the one that I explained before. Also, to have explicit ad hoc separate control on the PPP liabilities does not allow to take the benefit of situations in which the amounts of overall debt can be lower. I mean, if we are in certain years that we are amortizing the debt faster, we are able to decrease the percentage that the explicit debt represents over the GDP. So we are creating fiscal space. We are diminishing the overall liabilities of the country. But if we have, for PPPs, we have a explicit and separate amount, I cannot take the benefit of this additional fiscal space, okay? And the opposite can happen, which is that according to the regulations for PPP limits, I could still be allowed to enter into new liabilities under PPP schemes, even if the explicit level of debt or the explicit debt levels are extraordinarily high, which is not very reasonable, correct? In the end, PPP projects should compete with conventional contracts, so with public finance. In other words, private finance, which is PPPs, should compete with public finance, should compete for the same resources. I mean, the fiscal revenues and the fiscal capacity to make payments is only one. So everything should be under the same radar. I think that otherwise we can create perversions. How it is good fiscal impact control? No matter in which manner can we control the fiscal impact, including this via that is that of the explicit ad hoc PPP limits, okay? But it still is good to have some kind of control. And what are the benefits of this? I can control in that manner the aggregated PPP commitment. I can control fiscal risks. I mean, fiscal risks is the risk that at some point I cannot meet my payment obligations in the future. So I should really avoid to enter into excessive fiscal commitment that can be produced because of these PPPs, because of this perception that is money for free. If I am not incorporating PPP liabilities into the accounting, I need to have some control, otherwise I can enter into excessive commitments, okay? Monitoring the affordability of individual projects is very healthy. Certain projects by themselves could, thank you, Paloma, could represent a danger by itself. And also, I should control PPP commitments. I should control PPP commitments at a sector level. For a particular sector, we should take into account which is the level of leverage that we are assuming with respect to PPPs. To have a very high percentage of the budgetary allowances of a particular sector, for example, transportation or roads, it can be dangerous because PPPs brings a lack of flexibility. We are committing in advance future resources. If a very significant percentage of the average budget of the last year is committed into PPPs and a crisis is coming, then for example, road projects are not going to be a priority. Priority is going to be social expenditure. That means that the budget allowed for roads, it will be diminishing. So there is a big risk at that point that the Ministry of Public Works, for example, doesn't have sufficient resources to pay for the PPP obligations, because this ministry can see how the government is diminishing the budget available for roads. In fact, in Catalonia, for example, it was a study where the PPP commitments per year was around 7%, 8% of the budget managed by the Transportation Authority. Okay, but then it came the global crisis, Lehman and so on. So budget decreased. And you know, in the year 2010, 2011, 2012, the PPP commitments were representing even 30% of the total expenditure that the department was allowed to spend. So you see how dramatically increased their exposure to PPP commitments because of the crisis. Okay, so control the aggregated PPP commitment, monitor sectoral affordability, and also it's important, this kind of control, because it allows us to prioritize projects. It allows us to select which are the best projects for which we should reserve the limited resources. It also conveys budgetary discipline and encourage optimization of guarantees and risk retention. Because I mean, a proper fiscal control for PPP liabilities and a proper fiscal analysis will allow me to make apparent, evident, which is that there is a cost there related to contingent liabilities. And if I see that there is a real cost and I can have a measure of it, that will help me to optimize this risk, to optimize the use of guarantees and contractual guarantees and risk retention. And it will make, especially procuring authorities, managing better the risks. Because if procuring authorities understand the relevance of risks, they will be able to prioritize resources, human resources, teams, methodologies, etc., for a better manage of those risks. And also, it will put an accent in managing funds, being sure or ensuring that we will have funds in place to meet the contingent needs. This is what we call the liquidity risk, the risk that we don't have money in place to pay for a contingency, which is quite dangerous.